And it's Jerry Ashton with 15 Minutes of Fact here in New York City on WGRNradio.com. Today we have as our guest a Lakota man from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, near the Black Hills, the ancestral homeland of the Lakota Sioux. He is the founder of Indigenous Nations Network, a group which does advocacy and education amongst Native groups. William is in New York City today for his continuing work with the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Occupy movement altogether, for the purpose of re-educating the people involved in the Occupy movement as to the plight of the Native American, who we refer to, of course, as the American Indian. And when I say re-education, basically is to let people understand that many of the conditions that we are complaining about in the Occupy movement have been suffered by the Native American for centuries. William started with Occupy DC at its very beginnings and has visited sites in Cincinnati, Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, Occupy Oakland, Marin, Santa Cruz, and San Francisco. So we are pleased to have this American Indian person with us today to be able to explain who he is, why he's involving himself with the Occupy movement. So welcome to the program today, William.
First, I'd like to say good afternoon, and I shake your hand with a glad heart.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I'd like to get right into the meat of our 15 Minutes of Fact by discussing two items with you. Number one, of course, is Occupy Wall Street and Occupy in general. And then we're going to also want to bring up the subject of Leonard Peltier. So let's first go to Occupy Wall Street. What was your first experience? Why did you show up at Occupy Wall Street in D.C., and what was your first experience there?
Well, I first heard the rumblings about Occupy Wall Street a couple of months prior to the actual event, and people were inviting me to bring the indigenous voice to Occupy Wall Street. And, of course, I couldn't just come to Wall Street right away, so I found the nearest Occupy location, which was Occupy D.C. at McPherson Square. And I went there at one of the initial General Assemblies. I listened in, and I thought it was very interesting that people were talking and using a process called the human mic and a consensus process to reach agreements. So I basically started trying to involve myself, and as I got there, I realized people weren't very friendly. It was more like wariness, and people weren't greeting each other in a nice way. And I stood there for a couple hours, and nobody even came up to greet me, and nobody even said, "Hey, how you doing? What are you doing here? Would you like to join us?" And I realized that there again, I was being discounted and not really looked at. So I started thinking about what can I do to bring my voice here.
Well, let me intrude there for a second and talk about that experience. As a native, if these fine folk had shown up on the reservation, would they have been treated the same way?
No, definitely not. We would actually definitely walk up to them and greet them, shake their hands, and ask them if they're hungry.
Well, that was something that you didn't experience. So in spite of the fact of the initial feeling of separation, then what happened? What caused you to get either welcomed or deeper into that movement there?
Well, first of all, I realized that, again, when people come to them, we bring our own voices into it and add our voices to a collective voice. So I felt like that I had to actually step forward and make a statement and introduce myself and immediately start with some of the working groups because, again, I realized that if we don't put our voices in there, we're not going to be invited. So I initially started working with the outreach group, again, to reach out to Native Americans. And in D.C., there are many Native American advocacy groups, nonprofits, so I felt like I would be the lead in reaching out to those organizations. And so that's what I did. I immediately started with the outreach, and I joined the People of Color Working Group. And through there, I slowly started getting recognized. And it was a big help because, again, we have to continuously stick our foot in these doors and push these doors open. They're not going to be open for us.
Well, I'd like to talk about that because what's true of the Native American is of all the ethnic groups in the United States and the very original people of the United States, before the United States was ever thought of, you had your own way of being able to communicate experiences and to lead people. One of the complaints, or maybe the mysteries about Occupy Wall Street, is that they claim that it's leadership, that it's leaderless, and yet I see you self-identified as a leader. So explain how that came about.
Well, myself, I consider that because I definitely I'm not a leader. I'm a follower. But also, when I speak up, I get put into positions to where I have to make statements on behalf of larger groups or behalf of tribes. So I don't consider myself a leader, but again, it's part of being an activist. You have to stand up and make statements, and then you get thrust into the positions of leadership. And there are leaders within the movement. It's just that they're not being elected or selected or put forth. But there are definite leaders, and there are definite people that use these positions to either include or exclude people. And it's a strange fact, but that's just the way the Occupy is working right now.
Well, I also have, from the very beginning, because I became involved in the Occupy movement in New York City, probably the first week after it began, and when I learned more about what it was about and the complaints and the inequities and the obvious wrongs that need to be righted that this one group of people were willing to camp out for and to make noises on and actually attract a lot of positive attention. In some cases that's lasted, some cases it's improved, some others it's not. But what I also noticed about the Occupy group is that in the entire encampment there was one little table with an American Indian sitting there. And I wondered to myself, given the fact that the very first people who were occupied were the Native Americans, where were they? Where were the Indians? And what would be the motivation for someone to even care to show up at this largely European, although really not as much as people might imagine, thing that's called Occupy? What was your motivation as an American Indian to do that, and what do you suggest to other American Indians?
Well, I go back to the thought of Thanksgiving, where once again we're having to reach out to European ancestry persons and reach out to them to include us in the events and the things that are going on around Occupy. So for me, I look around and I say, well, where are the natives? Where are they? And again, they've been coming around, but many times it's coming around together as a group. Because when we come to these events or other places by ourselves, it's almost like we stick out, but also nobody pays attention to us. So many natives have come through, and there have been days of action and days of solidarity in different places. And Occupy Oakland definitely has a Native American contingency that are continuously working with Occupy Oakland. But again, I believe the draw is not there, because once again, we have to look at the larger society. And no matter what, we are still dealing with Americans that still have the same prejudices and still have the miseducation and being directed in the wrong way towards Native America. So when we show up, we actually represent other people. So that's kind of the issue that's going on, is when a few of us show up, we represent a whole bunch of people behind us.
What I'm also intrigued by is the fact that the Occupy movement has really served as an umbrella for people who individually have put out their voices, have made themselves known, but not nearly with the effectiveness of what could be under this thing that's called Occupy. For example, there's the union people. There are the people that are involved in the gay community. There are people that are involved in La Raza. There are people that are involved with student debt. There are people that are involved with community affairs and helping people who are being dispossessed of homes. So all of these people who have been individually, as a group and as individuals, crying out against the injustices, and the Indian has really not had an opportunity to get together with all these people in one place. So is that making a difference?
It has definitely been making a difference because of the fact that there's much larger groups and an association of other groups that are paying attention finally. And again, it's just because of the fact that our voices are continuously being put forth. So, yes, the attention is starting to happen. And a couple of the things that I really would like to see is, again, more attention paid to the banks that don't exist on the reservations or any kind of financial institutions except such things as payday loan organizations or the issue of the land being continuously taken away by the top 1%, these shareholders that sit on top of mining companies or corporations that are doing damage to Mother Earth. So, yes, we really do need to reach out and continue asking the Occupy and America to continuously pay attention to us. And it's happening, but slowly.
Well, it is an educational process, which actually you term a re-education, because we in America, reading the history books that we grew up with, there was never, in my experience, and I became involved in Indian country several years back, but prior to that, many people I know would wonder if the Indians, number one, still existed. Number two, if they did, were they all on reservations? And it was almost insulting to an entire culture of actual nations, sovereign nations, to be forgotten or put to the sidelines like this. I'm pleased about the fact that you folks are coming on board with Occupy to really show people the energy and strength that you have, and also educate us as to what needs to be done in Indian country. In particular, the second part of the interview, I wanted to deal with one extreme example, and that being Leonard Peltier. And I would like to have you tell the audience about Leonard, why they should want to know about him, and what should be done about this.
Well, first of all, I want to say hello to Leonard, if he's listening online. Hang in there, cousin. We're working on trying to get you out of there. And first of all, Leonard was a group of people that came to the Pine Ridge Reservation in the early 70s. Because of the situation of racism, prejudice directed at the traditional, what I call traditional, and the full-blood Native Americans, the Lakota, there was issues that were going on that was very hard, such as the goon squads and the rednecks that were continuously harassing and bothering Native Americans and really just terrorizing Native Americans during this era, which was called the Reign of Terror. It wasn't just the mixed bloods against the full bloods. The racism and the prejudice of the state of South Dakota has been very evident, and I believe that they really don't appreciate what happened. But the call went out when women and children and elders and people that are not able to fend for themselves were being abused. And specifically one instance in Gordon, Nebraska, where there was a Native American man made to dance naked and burned with cigarette butts and literally thrown out into the streets to die. And that's what happened. He died. And therefore the call went out to the warrior society called American Indian Movement. And a lot of these American Indian Movement people were Vietnam veterans and veterans from other wars, and realized that America still has issues with Native Americans. So they came to South Dakota in defense of the women and children and the elders.
Now, what period of time was this?
This was the early 70s, 1970s, where people were starting to fight for civil rights. The civil rights movement had kicked off in the 60s, and so many things were transpiring as far as that was concerned. But when Native Americans, Indians, started standing up in defense for ourselves, we realized we really had a lot of power. And out of that became an occupation called Wounded Knee, where all of these people that came initially ended up having to defend a site, a sacred site, and basically occupy that site and stand in defense of the women and children. So Wounded Knee was a flashpoint. It brought many Native Americans there, but not just Native Americans. It was a place where Americans could come and support. And once again, the federal government, the United States military might, was pointed at Wounded Knee again. And, of course, there were some people that died, mainly Native Americans, and then people were imprisoned. And there were many things that happened where Native Americans and Native people were being persecuting it once again just because we stood up for our human rights, our cultural rights, and our civil rights.
Well, that's exactly where people involved in Occupy are beginning to understand that what the American Indian has suffered for centuries, unnoticed by so many of us, is actually something that is beginning to show up in their own communities, whether it be Hispanic or whether it be Middle America, someone who's out of a job and someone who's losing a home, that all the power and the might of the government, poorly used, is causing this type of thing, which is requiring people to fight back in their own ways. Now, the occupation is a word, but there was also Occupy Alcatraz, wasn't there?
Yes. There were many occupations across the United States into the 60s, 70s, and 80s where continuously we have to stand up and literally go occupy places to bring the plight to the world and to let them know that we are still here. So Occupy Alcatraz was one of the longest running occupations that happened in America. And out of all of those issues became a flashpoint, and one was in honor of somebody named Leonard Peltier, who we are at the moment trying to free from federal clutches. He's been in the federal prison system as a political prisoner for the last 36 plus years, and he's getting to be an elder, and he's getting very sick, and he needs our help. And so at this moment, right at this moment as I'm speaking, there is a spiritual walk coming across the country towards Washington, D.C., and eventually it's going to show up here in New York City at the United Nations in mid-May, beginning of May. There's something called a permanent forum on indigenous issues, where they want to bring this plight of Leonard being held political prisoner all these years. And the reason for the spiritual walk is because that is our last hope. We're counting on Creator, but also we're going to urge President Obama, who was adopted by a Native American tribe, who claims to be a Christian with compassion. So we're going to ask him to assert his authority and offer Leonard an executive clemency. Leonard has been in prison for more than these 36 years under brutal, torturous conditions where they are torturing him, and they're trying to make him an example, which we believe is the wrong thing to do, because there again, America has really an obligation to Native America. And first of all, there's a myth that says that we get free education. No, we gave up so much land, so much sovereign land, that this education is not free. And to this day, Native Americans are still being pushed to the edge of this educational system. So many things go on, and the human rights and indigenous rights that we're asking for on behalf of Leonard doesn't just apply to Leonard. It applies to many aspects of society. So as Leonard speaks up on behalf of society, of indigenous society, we have to take his message and continue working across the globe to alert people of the plight of Native America. And again, other words come up: reparations for one, return of homelands, ancestral homelands, return of sacred bones that have been unearthed in many places. There's so many issues. And the biggest one that is that these banks don't have any kind of obligation to the Native Americans that they stole the land from. You go out to Pine Ridge and you won't find a bank on the reservation or many lands across this America where it's Native land. The banks just won't come there.
William, you've talked about flashpoints. It's the flashpoints for the European, for the American, the typical American, has been the banks, or as I call them, the banksters. What you have to say to us is actually going to be going to have to go into several interviews like this. So I'd like to take advantage of the limited amount of time that we have left to thank you so much for sharing yourself and your views and your experience as an American Indian with the Occupy Wall Street movement. I'd also like to put out information about you, contact details, because one of the things that's very, very important for people like you who've given up home and hearth to go out on the road to sleep in the homes of friends and wherever you could, is the fact that you need to be supported financially in this. So I'd like to have people, for whatever reason, in support or financial, or to offer whatever they can to help the movement, to write to you directly at Hotmail at Willie Chili, spelled WILLYCHILI, WillieChili@hotmail.com, and to offer to you not only their physical, emotional, mental, spiritual support, but if they're able to do so, financial as well. Would you leave us with an Indian prayer or an Indian thought that we can take away from this interview?
Well, many times I give thanks to the Creator, because as we speak and put our prayers and our voices out there, we have to use these things called radio frequency waves. So again, I just want to offer some thanks to you all and offer a word of encouragement to Occupy Wall Street in my language, which is spoken Lakota. We just need your help and support to continuously bring these issues up and to re-educate America about us, about the fact that we are still here. Many of us are survivors of an attempted genocide on our lives. So I appreciate your efforts to support us, to bring our voices to the world, and to use these sacred smoke signals, as I call them, to the world. Hechetuelo.
Thank you so much, William Underbaggage. This is Jerry Ashton with WGRNradio.com, reminding people as well that you can go to Facebook and search for Occupy sites. You can go to LinkedIn, where you'll find Native American groups on LinkedIn, and also my group, which is called Occupy Everywhere. So, Jerry Ashton signing off for WGRNradio.com.